evening and welcome. You're watching the intersection of money and politiki. My name is Karabole Tlhatla, and tonight we put the economy and all its politics center stage. On Friday, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced reforms and measures to boost and kickstart the economy. But immediately after the president announced his measures, the currency took a dip. Is this a sign of the lack of confidence in the confidence plan? I will be speaking to Gossel, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. And later, I'll be hearing from Nedbank chief economist Dykes. But first up, Sean joins me now via Skype. Sir, as always, I thank you for your time. Is it a sign of things to come when the currency dips immediately after we introduce the confidence plan?
Unfortunately, you're correct. It is an indication that business in particular does not have much confidence in the rollout of this plan. It's not the first plan we've had. We've had many plans over the years. And invariably, that's all that happens. We come up with a very good plan, and then the implementation never really reaches the end goal that is foreseen or desired. And I suspect that business is just saying, well, it's more of the same.
Well, Sean, ultimately it's business that has to buy into this plan. From my understanding, the 400 billion rands infrastructure fund is really hinging on the support of business in terms of funding and also in terms of delivery. How confident are you as to that plan?
Cautiously optimistic. I think at this stage, for it to really have the desired effect, we will need to be further in terms of the reforms of many of our institutions in the country. We've had the Zondo Commission that's ongoing and many of the outcomes of that. But the actual institutions that are going to be required to give investor confidence haven't yet been reformed sufficiently. So I think that is going to take longer than anticipated. And I suspect that's one of the reasons that business is hesitant about the whole plan.
Sean, you speak about the State of Capture Commission that is currently going on. Of course, it will be restarting on Thursday, but that was the elephant in the room as far as I was concerned. I asked the Minister of Public Enterprise whether he was the elephant in the room, considering how very little had to do with state-owned entities. And by far, they are South Africa's biggest risk, especially when you look at Eskom. Were you not impressed that he didn't go far enough? I mean, we know that those institutions have to be leaner, have to be thinner, and have to react to the challenges of the times.
Indeed, but the government is in a very, very difficult position because ultimately many of these state-owned entities need to either be fully privatized or partially privatized in some way. And that's going to take a long time to actually achieve. So we're trying to put in place a stimulus plan to stimulate the economy very rapidly, but many of the impediments that are going to hamper the plan itself are long-run impediments. So overcoming those impediments then are therefore going to take much longer than the amount of time that would be needed for the stimulus. So as much as this is anticipated to be a short-term stimulus, it's not going to be a short-term stimulus accordingly.
Sean, you and I might say this, and I see the sensibility in partially privatizing an entity like Eskom. Let's try and cut our losses. But what's with government's lack of appetite with regards to this? It already sits at over 300 billion rands in terms of exposure of debt that it presents the country with. Eskom can still sink the South African economy. What's the holdup? If it was a plan, shouldn't it go far enough? Shouldn't it be brave?
I think politically at this stage, there isn't enough appetite and there isn't a position to be brave. Possibly after the 2019 election, it'll be new opportunities, but at the moment, it's unlikely. So much of the appetite for anything resembling privatization is off the table. With an election coming up, you wouldn't want job losses and everything associated with the instability that is inherent in a privatization process. Some institutions can't be privatized. For example, South African Airways cannot be privatized. There's not in any shape or form that it would be attractive to any investor. And the entities that you mentioned, for example, you mentioned Eskom, to privatize or partially privatize Eskom is a very long-term process. It's not something that we can engage in or undertake within the time frame associated with the stimulus package. And I suspect that's why there's the 50 billion on the other side that is basically just reallocations from different programs and different government departments to essentially kickstart the economy. So I think the actual stimulus plan is a combination both of short-term measures and long-term measures. The 400 billion is a long-term measure, and I think the 50 billion is the short-term measure.
Sean, I read an extract from you. You were speaking about the cost to the economy that state capture has been, that it might even be part of the reason why we're here. We've been watching the global community of economies really going one way, and that's recovery following the 2009 crisis. And South Africa has not really recovered. It has not gone anywhere and it has not grown. So if state capture really cost us this technical recession that we're going through right now, by not addressing the problem as state-owned entities, aren't we just kicking the can down the road and we're really not changing anything? Everything else is just cosmetic.
In terms of just political realism, I don't think the government at the moment can do very much that is truly radical. As much as we bandy the term around, everything is radical. Very little of it is actually radical. Carry on with whatever we've done before. I think anything radical will have to wait.
So, Sean, I think, to be fair to the president, there was some highlights there. For instance, the additional nurses to be employed by the Department of Health. I mean, anybody who's gone through the public health system will surely say yes, and we need more on top of the number that you have espoused. But when it comes to the issue of land, for instance, I mean, we saw a scathing article that was leaked by the Mbeki Foundation about the doublespeak that the ANC has with regards to land, that they're using it almost from a populist point of view. But when you hear the president saying that he's appointing a 10-man advisory panel on land, don't you worry about the parallel processes that are going on within land? And what should that 10-panel committee say to him? Some say that they must actually start by saying that the president cannot expropriate without compensation.
Well, yeah, this issue is all about elections. It's not about actual policy formulation, and that's why you're seeing this doublespeak constantly. And hopefully after the 2019, we'll have greater clarity. At the moment, that's all we're going to see, is we're going to see essentially electioneering, using yet another aspect of South Africa's history as for political discourse. So, yes, you mentioned about the 10-man committee that we have, and indeed this committee should be looking at means of more than just the extent of should we actually change the constitution, but more so around the actual impediments to what hasn't worked over the last 20 years. There's a large portion of commentators, academics, etc., that say that you don't need to change the constitution. What you actually need to use is the tools that are already in the constitution, and those haven't been adequately used, which is why we've landed up in this position where we have a target of 30% that we want to redistribute, and we're sitting at around about 21%. So there are means to address land reform without having to change the constitution. That, personally, I think is something that this 10-man committee should be looking at. Much of the rhetoric that we hear about let's just rush off and change the constitution can lead to significant side effects down the line, because it does potentially open the Pandora's box of eroding property rights. And that's one of the crucial metrics that numerous studies have shown is one of the surest ways to lose the capital from international investors, and that's something South Africa can't afford.
Sean, I'll part on this. Today we heard the Minister of Home Affairs really putting meat on the bone with regards to some of the changes that have been announced. Today we got a new visa regime, if you will. But some say in the tourism sector, that's what they've been urging government to do in the first place when they introduced the measures first in 2014. Did we see Melusi Gigaba backing down on a regime that he introduced during his first stint in the Department of Home Affairs? And also, how much dent can it really make when we still have a visa regime with Nigeria, which is very keen on descending on our shores?
Yes, I think those particular visa restrictions, that is definitely a step down, and it falls within the ambit of trying to restart the South African economy. That these visa restrictions that were introduced in 2014 were irrational, and it's taken us 4 years to realize just how irrational they are. And unfortunately, there's a lot of tourism-related and visa-related legislation that is similarly, you mentioned about Nigeria, similarly irrational as well. So yes, it is a climb down. It's ironic that Melusi Gigaba, who introduced the legislation, has gone full circle and landed up now back the minister again, and having now also to repeal those same restrictions. It's funny how everything works in circles.
We must all clean our own dirt at some point. I guess it was quite funny. Thanks to Sean Gossel, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. I also had an opportunity to speak to Dennis Dykes, who's the chief economist with the Nedbank Group, and asked for his take with regards to the stimulus package. Here's what he thought. Dennis, give me your immediate reaction to President Ramaphosa's economic recovery and stimulus package.
Well, I think there's a lot of good stuff in the package, but what we're lacking at the moment is detail. So a lot of what needs to be revealed will come out in the medium-term budget policy statement, but we don't know, for example, where the reprioritized expenditure is going to come from, where it's going to be taken from. We don't know too much about the 400 billion rand fund. We don't still know all the details in the mining charter yet, and so forth. So if all those things come together, I think it's got the potential of being a good package. But there is a lot that needs to happen on the implementation side, and that's not been our strength.
Is that what you think caused the immediate reaction in the currency? We saw it picking up a bit and then continuing back to the sliding fashion we're accustomed to by now.
Yeah, perhaps that is the case. You know, I think people expected maybe a higher level of detail for certain of the issues. In particular, there was an expectation around the mining charter, a lot of the detail to be released so that it could be immediately assessed. And then basically really just not too much coming out as far as that's concerned. So that could have caused some of the disappointment. But as I say, there are encouraging aspects. I think the visa regulations, the immigration policy, all that sort of thing. The only puzzling thing there is that, you know, it's within the next few months. And we've been having these debates now for the last 4 years. And there's been intensive discussions between the departments over the last year or so. So I'm not quite sure why it's taken another few months.
I was about to ask you that we started talking about visa regulations when Malusi Gigaba was still the Home Affairs
Goes back to 2014.
Became Finance Minister and back to Home Affairs again, and we're still talking about visa regulations.
That's right.
So when you think about that and the terrible track record that our government has with regards to implementation, what hope do you have for the stimulus package? What does it mean? Is it better than the ink gets written on?
Yeah, look, I think the problem with implementation, we've got the wrong people in the wrong jobs at all levels of government, but particularly on the ground. You know, so there's been obviously deployment policies, and that needs to fundamentally change over time. But it is going to take some time. So, you know, it's good to have high-level panels. It's good to have teams in the presidency and so forth. But to actually have it filter down is very difficult. And we've even seen with things like Eskom, Madupi Kusile taking, you know, an infinite amount of time. A world record for basically delivering a power plant, a coal-fired power plant. It's, so these are not world records that you want to be proud of, unfortunately.
Look, he did say something. He says we've learned from our 2010 World Cup experience as to how we can deliver better. So do you feel like we are under a new presidency, that he will actually have a conscientious effort that is put on delivering things on time and completely?
Look, I mean, that's a key point. The World Cup was really delivered by the private sector, the construction companies, and I mean, very clearly the Gautrain project, all those were very much private sector driven. Unfortunately, though, there was a lot of controversy around that. The construction companies are nowhere in the state that they were in at that time to deliver on very big projects. And in the meantime, we've actually seen that the public sector institutions deliver at, you know, not good at delivering. So I would have liked to have actually seen a much bigger emphasis on private sector participation and leaning on the private sector, where you've got the skills, you've got the resources to deliver, and also the finances to actually have these projects delivered. And there's only an allusion to it. It's sort of like an uneasy kind of like illusion rather than any sort of concrete detail.
Dennis, what do you make of the land panel? Some people say this is the presidency, again, running a parallel process to that which is happening in government. And Godfrey Mutizwa, the man who is actually anchoring this program, is very worried about that. And he says that he expects that panel to tell President Ramaphosa that expropriation without compensation is not good economics.
Yeah, look, Yeah, it is a bit of a detail that's kind of like missing. Does that panel advise Parliament as well? And what will Parliament say? I mean, they're having gone through this whole process. Has it the potential to reverse the ANC's decision that they announced at the end of July? All these things are pretty much unknown. We do know that there are people on the panel who basically, along with a lot of the more technical advice, have actually indicated that we don't need to change the constitution to affect land reform. But we know that it's been very much a politically driven process rather than an economically driven process. So it's difficult to see what might happen there. But nevertheless, I think it's encouraging, that we've got this panel which can actually advise and have continuing input into the process.
Dennis, if you were advising the president, or if you had a transcript of what he was going to read out, what would you say was missing in today's speech?
Well, I mean, there's a sentence on the cost of doing business in South Africa, basically, and I would have actually liked the speech to have been about that, the cost of doing business and the risks of doing business in South Africa, because I think what we've seen over time is layer upon layer of regulatory costs, and it's very clear that the burden of those costs are now actually starting to drag business down. If you look at manufacturing capacity over the last 3-4 years, it's clear there's something structurally wrong. It's not just a cyclical factor. We actually underperforming very significantly. If you look at mining, well, since 2004, it's basically been on a downward trend, even excluding the sort of structural issues in the gold mining industry. So something's going wrong there. Part of it is higher electricity costs. But as I say, we seem to be placing more and more burdens on business, and eventually it's starting to actually sag. So we've got to start changing that mix, reducing the risks, improving the rewards, much more investment-friendly policies, much more business-friendly policies, because ultimately that's how you get investment and jobs.
We've seen 2 consecutive contractions, quarter contractions, which has led us to this technical recession. When you think about the damage that was done to the country's economy, while every other economy in the world was growing, South Africa was actually going the wrong way. How long do you think we'll be in this low growth trap for? And are these the kinds of measures that can really, change the price of milk?
Yeah, look, I think things like the interventions on the tourism side, I think those are very quick wins. So if you had a benign tourism visa regime, I think you could ramp up tourism very, very quickly in South Africa, and I think that's fairly labor intensive. So it has a quick win in terms of inclusivity of that growth. If government actually concentrated on a bit more, with helpful policies, not just the visa regime, I think that could be a very, very quick win. Similarly, mining will take a bit of time to actually make up the lost ground, because exploration has actually fallen dramatically over the last decade or so. But once that starts to gather momentum, you could actually have a lift-off in mining industry.
I asked Minister Nene which departments he's going to take money from and which he's going to prioritize, a question which he skirted around and told me something about midterm budget policy statement. So I'm going to ask you, where do you think he should take money from to take it to priority areas?
Yeah, look, I mean, 50 billion odd is quite a lumpy sum to just sort of extract. So it's going to be a bit of a magician's trick to see where it actually comes from. I don't actually know. And I think that's, obviously people will be looking at the medium-term budget policy statement with a lot of interest now. Who's losing this cash? But what's clear is, I mean, they can't add to the fiscal burdens in the statement. Otherwise, rating downgrades might occur, and you might have a loss in investor sentiment towards the country.
After the break, one of those changes is coming into effect already. We'll be discussing the new changes to the visa regime. Stay tuned.